Hi guys, it's Sophie. So I'm going to be doing my non-fiction wrap-up today. I will link the fiction section up above, down below, however it works now. And if you've seen that video, then you know that I essentially forgot to wrap up anything for about 3 months. So I've got a little pile of non-fiction to share with you. I'm not going to do huge amounts on each one, I don't think, but I'll just let you know what they were and what I thought. The first one that I have here is Hired by James Bloodworth, which is an account of one fairly well-off man travelling around for 6 months working in a variety of minimum wage jobs in the UK. So he goes to different areas that are kind of known for being a bit shit for low wage jobs. He goes to Rugley, Blackpool, the South Wales Valley and London. And in each he works for a different kind of industry. So he works for Amazon in one. Another one he works, I think he works as like a call centre, but the job never really comes through. When he's in Wales he works for Admiral, and in London he works as an Uber driver. So not only minimum wage jobs, but some that have been highlighted as having poor practice, and he talks about what it was like working those jobs in reality, and talks to a lot of people who work those jobs who obviously don't do so voluntarily. I thought that it was interesting, but I also felt as though I couldn't separate myself from the problematic element of someone who can at any stage walk away, walking into this life and being anonymous to everyone he meets. So he can't let the companies know what he's doing, as obviously otherwise it wouldn't be an authentic experience, but he doesn't let any of his colleagues know either, which can lead to quite an uncomfortable reading dynamic of this man pretending to be someone he's not to these people who are really in that circumstance. And I wonder why they didn't, like, I like the idea of this book, but I wonder why it was made and they didn't look for someone who worked those jobs. I don't know, I can't really fault necessarily the author. I think as he is, that's the best he could have done, but I kind of think it would have been more interesting to have spoken to people who actually work those jobs constantly. And to be fair, a lot of this book is like interviews with people in those jobs. I'm still glad I read it, and I do think it's really interesting to read about some of the things that can happen to people in minimum wage jobs that you might not be aware of. I've worked minimum wage jobs in retail, but I didn't have the same experience that he had, certainly, but I can kind of empathise a little bit from people who couldn't get out of that life. Obviously I've managed to get out from a minimum wage job to a salary job. I'm still glad I read it, just couldn't get that problem out of my head. The next one I have is a memoir, and that is This Really Isn't About You by Jean Hannah Edelstein, and I got this one for review. It's out this month actually, August 2018 in the UK, and it is published by Picador. This is a memoir about a young woman who moves back to the States from Berlin, and she's kind of gone to Berlin through Europe, through England, but she moves back to the US when she finds out her father's dying of lung cancer, to kind of be near him and care for him and experience that part of his life with him. But she finds out the reason her father has cancer is because he has a genetic condition that makes it a lot likelier than the average population to develop certain kinds of cancer, and she finds out that she shares that gene. And so we're talking about grief and death, but also the kind of looming sense of mortality as well. I thought there'd be more about her life in here than maybe her father's life, but I felt as though in some ways this was an elegy to her father and who he was, which I enjoyed. As I say, like I quite liked this, but it felt as though it was more about him than her, and I think I would have been more interested in her perspective and her feelings and her fears, and whilst those were explored, it wasn't until kind of the latter half of this book, and I wonder how long it's been since the time period that this was written, and whether sometimes in memoir people need a little bit of time to kind of gather their thoughts and think back. But I did really enjoy it, and I think it's worth a read if you are kind of worried about these kind of things, about how your family's genetics might impact you and how that feels. And in this book you find that she very much feels like she's almost carrying a legacy, even if it isn't one that she would have chosen. Next one I have is a really short little memoir piece of non-fiction, creative non-fiction, called The Guardians by Sarah Manguso, and you guys might know that she's one of my favourite non-fiction kind of memoirists. I think she's brilliant, and this is about a friend that she had who was very unwell for quite a long time and committed suicide, and she follows with the people who surrounded him, trying to find out what happened in those last few hours of his life. So he leaves a hospital and turns up dead, and nobody really knows what he did in that time period. So she's remembering her friend, and also just kind of that ceaseless desire to know and to think of him in that scenario with no one else there is quite heartbreaking. Yeah, I enjoyed this one. I've liked the ones about her own life a little bit, as in her personal life. She had an illness, she has an autoimmune illness that's affected her a great deal, and I found that one a bit more strong as a piece, but I still really enjoyed The Guardians. And the next one I have is called Things I Don't Want to Know, and this one's by Deborah Levy. And this is more kind of memoir style writing, broadly based on Why I Write by George Orwell, and kind of that idea expanded out. And Deborah Levy talks about her own writing process, but also very much about her own life and how that plays into her writing. I thought it was actually a fascinating little book, and the one that comes with it, The Cost of Living, is kind of her looking at the next stage of her life. And reading this made me want to read her work a lot more, and I have done since and really enjoyed it. I think that's a really cool thing when you have someone who can write memoir and essay really well as fiction, and you kind of have two ways of looking at who they are in a weird, strange way. I would really recommend it. If you like Deborah Levy's fiction, then her non-fiction is also very good, and if you haven't read her fiction or aren't really that into it, I kind of went into her a bit sceptical because I didn't love the one I had read, which was Hot Milk. I thought it was quite good, but I didn't like fall in love with it. But her as an essayist I much preferred. Hey babes. The next one I have is Joan Didion's The White Album, and I'm slowly working my way through Joan Didion's whole collection of work. I'm really enjoying it. The White Album is potentially less personal to some extent than her other books are that I've read so far. It's very much a book about its time and what it was like sort of living in the 60s. It says that she waits in an empty room for Jim Morrison to turn up. She goes and visits the Black Panthers in prison. She goes to parties with Janis Joplin, buys dresses for Charles Manson's girls, which that part of the story I found fascinating. And what I loved about this book really was how just interesting and out there Joan Didion's life is. There's also a documentary on Netflix that I think someone recommended to me on here when I picked this book up, and it's also fabulous, and if I remember I'll link it down below. As I say, it's on Netflix, so you should be able to check it out. And it's just her talking back on her life and all the things she's done, and she's fabulous. She's so fabulous, and my goodness, in that film there are so many pictures and like shots of like the most beautiful books you could ever imagine, like just rooms of books. Yeah, it was really good, and I'm definitely just going to keep reading her. I also think that picture of her on the front is like one of the most amazing like self-portrait / portrait of an artist type things I've ever seen. She just looks so chill and unabashedly cool, and yeah, it's just amazing. The next one I have is The Secret Barrister, and this is a book published anonymously. This is a barrister who is talking about all of the things that happen kind of behind the scenes in the British legal system. I thought I'd really love this. I thought I'd find it similar to tell-alls I've read about the medical profession, and whilst I found it mildly interesting, I just didn't love it in the same way that I love learning about the medical element of it, and I don't actually think that is a problem with the book. It's very dense. It's very dense in technical detail, which I thought was a bit strange because, I don't know, I think he's trying to explain his points, but it could just make it a bit like, yes, okay, fine, I'm kind of bored of learning this bit now. I think it was more that I'm not as interested in law as I am in medicine. But yeah, I don't know, I'm kind of slightly glad I read it, and kind of almost it's quite long for how little I enjoyed it. I did like learning about the other countries' legal systems, and especially other countries in Europe. I didn't realise their legal systems were quite so different, but if you already have an interest in the law, then pick it up, but maybe if not, maybe don't. Yeah, that would be my kind of tentative review of that one. Next I have But Flesh and Not by David Foster Wallace. It's a collection of essays, and I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. He talks a little bit about maths, a little bit about writing, a little bit about tennis, and I think weirdly the tennis one's my favourite in these. But if you like David Foster Wallace, it's more of him, and you guys know I really do. And yeah, I flew through this one, and there's one on, is it on Roger Federer? Yeah, that I really liked, and I'm not a sporty Tennessee person at all, so yeah. I don't know, he just interests me in lots of different ways. So there's David Foster Wallace. One I read a while ago was Hunger by Roxane Gay, which I think most people have heard of already. It kind of went round the rounds a little while ago. But this is a broadly put together book by Roxane Gay about her relationship with food and her body. The comment has been made, and I think it's very fair, that because a lot of these were published as standalone essays or blogs, it can feel a little bit strange as a reading experience as a whole book. But I still really enjoyed it. I think it was a really uncomfortable read for me. I know that I deal with some like fat phobia that I have, and I think that links back to having had eating disorders previously, and this is still quite challenging for me. I don't feel as though I ever would act in a fat-phobic way, but I think I hold quite a lot of views and thoughts, particularly about my own body, that make reading this quite difficult, which is good. I like to read things that I find hard, and she's talking about how her body after sexual assault became a place where she could hide, I think, by piling on weight, and again that idea feels very uncomfortable for me because my response was almost the opposite. But yeah, I do think it's very much worth reading, and if you are similar to me you might find it helps to unsettle a few ideas that you might have, or a few automatic thoughts you might have. I've got some true crime to run through. I have The Adversary by Emmanuel, and this is a account of a man who is essentially like a con artist. He pretends to be a doctor working for, I think, don't know who he works for, it might be like WHO or something, but works for some large kind of medical agency, and brings back, if it is WHO, brings back all of these things from WHO to like prove that that's where he works. And he's not even a doctor, he's married and has a family, no one knows like who this man really is, not even his wife. And he commits murder. He kills and tries to kill himself, his whole family, and it's talking about why he did that and what makes someone pretend to be someone they aren't their whole life. Kind of vibes of The Imposter if you've watched that film. And yeah, I did enjoy it. It was a very different kind of true crime book than I read normally. Normally they're like big heavy hitter crime stories, but this was just kind of a more intimate one, and I really liked it. I have Jane, a Murder, that I know I've spoken about fairly recently and almost did a review on, so I'm not going to go over it too much. But this is a poetry collection telling a story of the murder of Maggie Nelson's aunt Jane, who was the victim of a serial murderer in the United States, and these poems are absolutely incredible. This was one of my kind of highest 5 stars so far in the year, and it's just some of these poems and some of these lines just hit you in the chest. Yeah, I'm just going to look through and just try and find if there's like one I can read you just to give you an example. So this short one is called The Call. My mother remembers something about Jane making a call for help, a frantic call from a public phone. But when I ask whom she called or from where, my mother admits her memory on this point is far from clear. I've looked and looked, but there's no record of any call. No, when Jane disappeared, she disappeared whole. It's a fantasy, I suppose, a way of breathing air into the cramp of that night. It gives my mother another chance to fail, and Jane another chance to fight. Yeah, really loved it. If you're into true crime, it's very, very, very good. And just one more on that topic, and that is The Fact of a Body by Alexandria Marzano-Lesnevich, and this is another kind of intimate true crime about a woman who is looking to become a death row lawyer and get people off of death row, and she comes across a case, her first case, of a man who killed a little boy, a man who was a paedophile through his whole life, who the authorities were aware of, and who seemed to have this almost like inexorable slip towards this murder. And she's asked if she could defend this man, and in considering this, it triggers memories of her own sexual abuse by her grandfather when she was a young girl, and she finds it impossible to unlink these two events, these two acts in her mind and figure out what she believes and why. Yeah, I think that's all I really want to say about this one. I read this one for my In Real Life book club, so I'm going to talk about it more in person, but I did enjoy it. I found it quite hard to read at some points, and there are some things other people have raised. For example, her sister doesn't talk about it as though she's been raped. She doesn't want to see herself that way, and therefore she's changed the names of her sister, but people have said she has a very unique surname for someone who's trying to anonymise their sister's name. Like, it wouldn't be too difficult to look up her name and find her sister. So there are some kind of issues with how it's gone about, but I think as it is, for her story, I found it quite an interesting way of weaving the two things together and bringing that personal element in again to true crime, rather than having a kind of eagle eye, almost voyeuristic view of true crime. A quick poetry collection. This one is The New Testament by Jericho Brown, and these are collections of essays. It's the kind of about being gay and about being black and how those two things intertwine. There's a lot of violence in this collection. There's a lot of things where you are assuming violence as well, sort of ways that the poems are told that you, with the knowledge you have about what happens and what has happened to black people historically, take in a very dark manner. But there are kind of elements of sex in here as well, and that experience of a gay man. And yeah, I did like it. I gave it 4 stars. I don't think I got it. I don't think I got all of it. I read quite a few of them out loud actually, and quite enjoyed that as an experience, but I've found others I feel I've understood more that talk about gay men of colour, and this one I felt I didn't jump into as much. There's quite a lot of religious language and metaphor in here as well, and I think that flew a little bit past me, but I did really enjoy it, and if you're interested in the topic then do pick it up. And the very last one is one that I read for an awfully long time, and that is How to Survive a Plague by David France, which is a fat book about the history of AIDS, the kind of beginning of the AIDS epidemic, and the men and women who fought to get treatment for and eventually the cure for AIDS. I really enjoyed this. I've read and watched more from a scientific perspective than I have from a civil rights perspective, and I found this book, whilst it does definitely have medical elements in terms of the drugs specifically, but I found it more about the people, and I actually ended up like sobbing at the end of this book. There's a lot of pain here, and there's a lot of really difficult stories and a lot of death, and I think I kind of barreled along through it, just accepting it and accepting it and accepting it, and I got to the end and just cried. I'm really glad that I read it, and I think it's given me a different view of AIDS to the one I had before I read it. Yeah, it's quite a challenging one, not just in its length but in the subject matter as well, and I think almost the relentlessness of these characters coming into frame and dying and then disappearing can be quite hard, but I think it's definitely worth a read, especially if you are interested in AIDS anyway, or gay rights at all within that period, because it talks quite a lot about how obviously the negative thoughts around gay people kind of prevented treatment, and how lots of people also kind of wished for like a straight person, like a famous straight person, to have AIDS, to bring this attention that actually it's not just a gay thing, it's not a dirty thing, it's just an illness. Yeah, so that is the last of my non-fiction that I read in the last 3 months. Hopefully you've enjoyed hearing a little bit about all these ones. Yeah, I thought I haven't done this in ages, so if you guys don't already know, I do have an Instagram account that's linked, which I always link down below, and a Twitter, so if you fancy following me on either one of those platforms then please do so, and I'll see you guys soon in my next one. Bye!